Well, good evening or good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time it is that you're watching this video. This video is about our data collection project. So I'm just going to talk briefly. Some of this I'm going to read to you verbatim, not because I want to insult your intelligence and I assume that you cannot read it on your own, but because I sometimes tend to speak a little quickly. And so I think that by me reading parts of it, especially the ones that are a little bit more complicated, that will force me to slow down. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to be looking at observing student behavior using 4 different methods. The first method that we're going to discuss is duration. All the methods that we're talking about in this video, or that I'm talking about in this video, are also covered and discussed in greater detail in chapter 4 of our text that we discussed in class. So chapter 4 of our text is a great resource if you've got additional questions. Otherwise, once you've watched the video and read chapter 4, if you still have questions, you can email me, text me, or call me, and I'll do what I can to help you through it. But pretty straightforward. As with all of our major assignments, as long as you follow the rubric, you should be perfectly fine. Do not stress out. It will be okay. I'm here to get you through it. So the first method we're going to look at is duration. And duration is pretty straightforward. We're looking at how long a behavior lasts. So for example, first of all, the behavior that we're looking at has to have a clear beginning and end. It can't be something like, calling out. Because, if I call out now and then a few seconds later call out again, it's not necessarily the how long I'm calling out. If I'm screaming or crying, that might be a duration. But for behaviors such as calling out or getting out of my seat, how many times I get up out of my seat, that would be more appropriate for something like frequency or event recording than for duration. Duration, we're looking for how long a behavior lasts. So, for example, a temper tantrum or off-task behavior, how long the student sat in his chair and did something other than what was being asked. Or we could be looking at the positive and looking for how long the student did remain on task, how long the student was able to sustain their silent reading during silent reading time, how long the student was able to remain in their seat and do their work. So it could be looking at the behavior that we're wanting to increase or the behavior that we're wanting to decrease. So duration is a measure of how long a behavior lasts. You could also use this for something that happens at a very high frequency. So for example, if you have a student that taps, is tapping their pencil, tapping their pen, tapping their foot, those type of things could be they happen too quickly to be able to count them accurately. So in other words, if you're looking at a 30-minute observation, you've got a student sitting there tapping, and you're trying to count the number of taps, that might be a little difficult. Whereas instead, if you say, okay, well, they started tapping at 9:05, they stopped tapping at 9:11, I can say, okay, the student was tapping for 6 minutes. A whole lot easier to record that than to simply try to count the number of times the student tapped 525 times. That would be more difficult. So you're looking for a behavior that, when we say clear beginning and end, so it's the beginning of the tapping and the ending, or something like the beginning of a tantrum, or it could be the beginning of crying, and then the ending of crying. So it's how long a certain behavior occurred. Like I said, it can be a positive or a negative. It can either be a behavior that when you're wanting to decrease or a behavior that you're wanting to increase. Duration can be reported in one of 2 ways. We can look at a percentage or we can look at an average. So for example, if we're looking at average duration of behavior, we're going to take the sum of the total durations and divide by the total occurrences. So for example, during a 60-minute observation, David had 3 tantrums. Those 3 tantrums lasted 3 minutes, 7 minutes, and then 5 minutes. So a total of 15 minutes. So if I'm looking at that 15 minutes and I'm looking for the average time, I would divide that by 3 because there's 3 tantrums, and I would get that he had average of 5 minutes spent per tantrum. If I'm looking at the percentage of observation where the behavior occurred, I would take that 15 minutes. I would divide it by 60 minutes because we observed for an hour. We get 0.25, multiply that by 100, so we get 25%. So we can either say that 25% of the observation period was spent or a tantrum was observed, Or you could say that he had 3 tantrums with an average of 5 minutes per tantrum. It can be reported either way. So an example of how you could record the duration in Excel is given here. And an example of how you could graph that using a bar graph is also provided. This does not mean that this is the exact way that yours needs to look, or even the exact same type of graph that you need to choose. This is just simply here for an example. The second type of recording observation that we're going to look at is frequency or event. I know you're saying, but you said 4. Well, because you report it as either frequency or event. We'll talk about that. Frequency and event, also very straightforward. We're looking at how many times a behavior occurs. So it can be how many times Susie got out of her seat, how many times Susie tripped somebody, how many times Susie called out without raising her hand, how many times Susie said something inappropriate to a peer. So it can be any of those type of behaviors. Again, we need something that has a clear beginning and an end. We don't want, again, something that happens so frequently that we can't count it, such as the pencil tapping. But it needs to be something that's going to be something I can say, okay, it occurred 7 times during this time frame, or at a rate of 1 time per, or 1 time per minute, or whatever the case might be. So you're looking at counting how many times a behavior occurs. We could use this recording for things such as task initiation, protests to task, inappropriate sitting, littering, how many correct responses, how many incorrect responses, tardiness. And then also when we think about using data and observing behavior, we could also think about looking in the mirror and thinking about ourselves. I've known several, or heard of several teachers, known a few, that have had either a colleague or a mentor teacher or an academic coach come into their classroom to help them with something that they personally wanted to improve. Whether they wanted to improve it because admin told them they needed to, or if they just wanted to improve it because it was a concern of their own. Say, for example, if I wasn't sure if I was providing wait time, if I wanted to have an idea of how many higher order questions I asked, as opposed to basic recall questions. If I wanted to know how many times I called on girls and how many times I called on boys as non-volunteers in class or as volunteers in class. Different things of that nature. I could have somebody come in and do a frequency count for me, so that way then I could use that data to help improve my own teaching practice. So just an example of how not only this could work for students, but it could also work for us as educators as well. Things to consider. When we talk about data, we have to make sure that when we're comparing data, reporting data, that we're talking about comparing apples to apples. So say, for example, if I'm observing the number of times Susie gets out of her seat, and if on Monday I go into class and I observe for the entire 45-minute Algebra 1 period, and then if the second day I'm in class, I'm observing it, lo and behold, we have a fire drill, and I was only able to observe for 20 minutes in class. And then on the third time I go in to observe Susie and see how many times she gets out of her seat, 10 minutes into class, she ends up getting sick and has to leave class and go to the nurse. So if I said, okay, well, on the first day I observed Susie, she was out of her seat 5 times. Second day I observed Susie, she was out of her seat 3 times. The last day I observed Susie, she was out of her seat 2 times. Well, if we look at that data, just simply looking at the numbers, we're going to say, hey, things are getting better. But the thing is, that 5 times was out of 45 minutes. The 3 times was out of 20 minutes. And the 2 times was out of 10 minutes. So is it truly getting better? What we'd have to do is convert it to a rate instead of just looking at the frequency. The frequency tells me how many times, period. The rate tells me, for example, how many times per minute. And that way I can compare apples to apples. So if your observation periods are the same every single time, frequency is fine. So if every single time that student is observed, they're observed for the entire class period, and the class period is always the same amount of time, 45 minutes, we're never changing schedules because of pep rallies or because of special programs or anything else, then we can compare it because it's apples to apples. However, if life happens, as it often does, And today it was 45 minutes. Yesterday you were on your way to observe and you got stopped in the hallway and you didn't make it to class until 10 minutes late. So that observation period was shorter. Or like I said, a fire drill, or Susie gets sick, or you get sick, whatever the case might be. Sometimes those time periods of observation are not consistent. In that case, that's when we need to convert it to a rate. So for example, frequency at the end of the observation period, total number of occurrences. For example, Anna left her seat 5 times during 7th period. So if we're always observing for the entire period, I can say 7th period 5 times, and it's crystal clear. However, if that time changes, count the number of times the behavior occurred in the time observed, divide the count by the length of the time the behavior was observed. For example, if Anna kicked a peer 30 times in a 10-minute observation, the rate would be 3 kicks per minute. That way I can compare Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday, even if one day I observed her for 30 minutes, another time I observed her for 10 minutes, and another time I observed her for 15. So you're still counting how many times a behavior occurred. That part doesn't change when you're doing your observation. The part that changes is how you summarize that data. If the time periods are consistent, frequency is fine. If the time periods vary, you need to convert it to a rate. This is a simple example of how that could be recorded using Excel. Again, this occurs over multiple days. For our class purposes, our 8-week class semester together, one day is perfectly fine. If you can go back over multiple days, great. But if not, that's fine. All I'm asking is that you spend a minimum of 45 minutes to an hour observing for each of the 4 types of behavior. If that occurs at 20 minutes on several different days, that's fine. If it occurs for 1 hour on one day, that's fine. So this is just an example of how that data could be recorded. All right, so now we've talked about 2. We've talked about duration and frequency/event. Now we're going to talk about latency. Latency and duration often get confused. They're both measures of time. However, duration is a measure of how long a behavior occurs, whereas latency is a measure of time from the prompt, the cue, the request, the directive, the instruction, until the behavior is finally initiated. For example, if you walk into class, you say, "Good morning, class. Please go ahead and take out your social studies books. Turn to page 325 so we can get started." And Susie sits there and daydreams and twists her hair and taps on her desk and stares out the window. And then 2.5 minutes later, she gets out her social studies book and turns to page 325. That 2 minutes and 25 seconds, or 2.5 minutes, however long it was, I said, that's your latency. Another example is when I taught elementary behavior mod and we had stations in our class. Of course, the station that my kiddos loved was the computer station. So they never had any delay in time in going to the computer station. However, I had a couple of kiddos who had some serious issues in latency in leaving the computer station. So when I gave the verbal direction, the verbal prompt, as well as then the chime, the cue that it was time to move from one location to the next, I would have students who suddenly couldn't hear me, suddenly couldn't hear the chime, and would need additional prompts. So there was a latency from the time I gave the directive to leave that station that they were currently at and to move to the next station in the rotation. There was a latency because they didn't want to leave the computer stations. So that time it took and the additional prompts is what I was looking at for those kiddos. Another example, when I go into my son's room in the morning and loudly but lovingly wake him up for school, the time from my prompts until the time that his eyes finally at least halfway open and his feet hit the floor, that's latency. So I'm looking at how long it takes for the student to actually initiate the behavior. So duration is how long the behavior lasts. Latency is how long it takes for the behavior to be initiated by the individual. A student in one of my previous semester classes, they thought of it as being, they looked at the beginning of the word latency, and they thought of it as being late to happen. And that's how they remembered the difference between the two. So when they gave the prompt, how much later or or how late was the student in initiating the behavior. And that's how they remember that latency was a measuring time between that prompt and the initiation of the behavior. Just an example of how someone else used to remember it. So when do we want to use this? Well, when we're looking for how long it takes for the student to comply with that request, how long it takes for a student to initiate the behavior. It can also be used academically. Say, for example, if we're working on learning sight words, how long is it from the time that I show the student the flashcard to the time the student can actually say the word? How long do they spend sitting there looking at it? If we're looking at multiplication facts and we want to get that automaticity in the multiplication facts, how long is it from the time that we put up the flashcard for 9 times 4 before the student responds with the answer? So we could be looking at that latency, the amount of time. Special consideration, like I said, those two often get confused, latency and duration. Just remember, like I said, duration is a measure of how long the behavior lasts. Latency is how long it takes for the behavior to get initiated. So that's the difference in those two. Again, we need to have a behavior that has a clear beginning and end, because I can't measure when something begins if I can't tell that it is beginning. So I need a clear beginning and end. Summarizing the data. Data is summarized by calculating the average latency, so the average time it takes for the behavior to start. So in order to do this, you calculate by summing all of the latencies and then dividing by the total number of opportunities. So for example, if during a certain class period, Shelley's teacher assigned 4 different assignments or assigned work 4 different times during that observation period. Shelley took 60 seconds for the first request, 90 seconds the next time, 35 seconds, and then the last one 50 seconds to start the 4 of the assignments. When we add that together, we get a total of 235 seconds. Divide that by 4 because she was asked to do 4 different tasks. So Shelley took an average of 58.75 seconds to start her assignment during the observation period. This is an example. Again, the example shown here is over multiple days. Yours does not have to be. Could be just multiple different requests in that one period. Could be one request in the one period, depending on what you have an opportunity to observe. This is just an example and an example of a line graph showing the difference in the latency time periods that it took for the student to initiate the behavior that was being requested. So duration, the length of time the behavior lasts. Frequency or event, simply a count of how many times the behavior occurs. Latency is the measure of time that lapse between the request and then the initiation of the behavior. All right, this one I am going to slow down and read. Interval recording is the one that's a little bit more complicated. Not difficult, but it is a little bit more complicated. So, interval recording documents whether a behavior occurred during a particular period. In order to determine this, an observation period is divided into brief intervals. At the end of each of these, the observer records whether or not a behavior has occurred. There are 2 types of interval recording, whole and partial. When utilizing whole interval recording, an observer indicates whether the behavior occurred during the entire time. For example, a student worked on an assignment during an entire 30-second interval. When utilizing partial interval recording, an observer indicates whether the behavior occurred at any point during the time interval. For example, a student worked on an assignment during 15 seconds of a 30-second interval. They would still record that, yes, the behavior did occur. Interval recording is used when it's difficult or impractical to constantly observe the behavior. Interval recording is used for continuous behaviors or for those behaviors whose onset and end are difficult to distinguish because the behaviors occur at such high rates. Whole interval recording yields data on the total duration of the behavior. Partial interval recording yields data on the proportion of the observations periods that the behavior occurred. Both whole and partial interval data are reported in terms of the percentage of total intervals during which the behavior occurred. So it's the number of intervals the behavior occurred divided by the total number of intervals and then multiplied by 100 to turn it into a percentage. Things to consider though. Interval recording does often take less time and effort, especially if the behavior occurs at a high frequency, so you're not trying to count every little thing. because the observer records the behavior only once during the interval, regardless of how many times. I'm not putting 30 tick marks. However, interval recording only provides an estimate of the actual number of times that a behavior occurs. If the intervals are too long, for example, an hour, the results can overestimate the frequency of the behavior. The shorter the interval, the more accurate representation of how often the behavior is occurring. For example, if aggression occurred once per hour in a 5-hour observation, a 1-hour interval recording form would conclude that the behavior occurred during 100% of the intervals, one occurrence in each 1-hour interval. However, if a 10-minute interval recording form was used, the results would conclude that the same behavior occurred during only 16.7% of intervals. So 5 out of the 10-minute intervals, because it still only occurred 5 times during that 5-hour period. So that's a key thing to remember, is when we're looking at setting up our observation, looking at how that time frame makes a huge difference. So when we're talking about behavior of a student, especially physical aggression of a student, there's a big difference in saying, well, Susie's physically aggressive 100% of the time, as opposed to saying Susie's physically aggressive approximately 17% of the time. There's a huge difference there. In both instances, physical aggression occurred 5 times during a 5-hour period. The difference was in how frequently we were watching, how frequently we were observing. So 100% as opposed to approximately 17%, huge difference. Huge difference. So how do we collect the data? So for example, if I'm going to observe for physical aggression for Susie, I might decide that, okay, for an hour, I'm going to break my hour into 10-minute observation periods. So they can be shorter, much shorter. We could be looking at a student every 5 seconds, every 15 seconds. It could be that I'm only observing for 20 minutes, so I'm going to observe the student every 2 minutes. It all depends on how you decide to set that up and how you decide to divide out those intervals. But for whole interval recording, so say, for example, if I set my fitness tracker, I can set it with silent alarms. So say, for example, if I'm observing a student for an hour, I can set it to go off, and if I want to set it for 5-minute recording, so I can set it for 105, 110, 115, 120, 125, so forth and so on, up until 2 o'clock. And what that fitness tracker will do on my wrist is it'll vibrate. So it gives me a vibration, silent though, nobody else knows it. I can feel it, but nobody else knows it's going off, unless they're right next to my arm and they actually hear the zzz, but otherwise they're never going to know. And you want it to be something that you know. You don't want it to be something that disrupts class or that lets the students know, because you don't want to introduce something that might alter the way that the behavior is going to occur in the classroom, the way the students are going to behave. So it's better if you're aware of it without them being aware of it. So for the whole interval recording, so every 5 minutes, I'm going to watch. So if I'm observing for an hour, I'm watching Susie, I'm looking for physical aggression. So I start watching at 1 o'clock. At 1:05, the buzzer goes off. So if I'm looking for a whole interval, I'm looking for that 5 minutes. Was Susie physically aggressive? If it's whole interval, for that entire 5-minute period. If yes, then I put an X on my recording form. If she wasn't physically aggressive for that entire 5-minute period, I put a 0 on that recording form. If I'm looking at partial interval recording during that 5-minute period, I'm just looking at any point was she physically aggressive during that time, even if it was only for 2 seconds. If yes, then I put an X. If not, then I put an O. So that's how you record for the whole and the partial. And then I'm going to count the number of intervals during which the behavior occurred, and then divide this number by the total number of intervals, multiply by 100 to turn it into a percentage. Keep in mind that interval recording provides an estimation. Whole interval recording typically underestimates the overall duration of the behavior, because if a behavior occurs, but not for the entire interval, we don't document it as having happened. Partial interval recording, however, typically overestimates the overall duration and underestimates the rate. because if a behavior occurs multiple times during an interval, it's still only documented as having occurred once. When using interval recording, the level of the behavior is reported as the percentage of intervals in which the behavior occurred. To calculate the percent of intervals, you're going to count the number of intervals in which the behavior was recorded, divide by the total number of intervals during the observation period, then multiply by 100. So for example, Mary was out of her seat during 4 out of 10 intervals, which gives you 4 divided by 10 is 0.4. Multiplied by 100, Mary was out of her seat during 40% of the intervals recorded during the observation. This is an example of what that data could look like. Again, this is over multiple days. Yours does not have to be. The O's represent no behavior reported or recorded. The X's represent that yes, behavior was recorded or observed. So this is one that I skipped. I'm sorry. This is just an example of how it could be written if you're looking at anecdotal information, of giving a description that goes along with it instead of just simply the O's and the X's. Not required, just an example of how it could be written. Okay, so now a variation. So a variation of interval recording is called time sampling. So in the last example, we divided up our observations into 5-minute intervals. So for time sampling, you also do the same thing. The only thing that in that 5-minute intervals, I'm only going to look at, instead of watching Susie's behavior for the entire 5 minutes, I'm only going to look at her behavior for like the last 30 seconds or the first 30 seconds of each of those intervals, which allows me, especially if I'm using like a 10-minute or a 15-minute interval, understanding though that the length of my interval is going to affect the validity of my data, but it allows me to still be able to teach or observe or do other things while also recording for behavior. So again, if I'm looking at 5-minute intervals, so when my timer or the fitness tracker vibrates to trigger that 5 minutes, now I'm going to look at Susie and I'm going to look at her for approximately, if we say 30 seconds, depending on how long you set up for your recording. But if we've decided that we're going to look at her for the first 30 seconds of every 5-minute interval for 1 hour, when my vibration goes off on my fitness tracker, I'm going to look at Susie. I'm going to look at her for 30 seconds. If during that 30 seconds, she is showing physical aggression, then I'm going to record that as yes, the behavior has occurred. So instead of noting whether behavior occurred or did not occur with an entire interval, 5 minutes, the observer only looks at the student during a sample of time. For example, 30 seconds. That's why it's called time sampling. Usually at the beginning or end of an interval, and records whether the behavior is occurring at that instant or small sample of time. Use this method if the teacher is interested in group performance, so that way you can look at multiple students. Or if we're looking at multiple behaviors. So if I want to know, okay, during this time, is there physical aggression going on? Is she out of her seat? Is she on task? So in other words, if I want to be able to chart multiple things, because at that vibration on my wrist, that gives me the signal, okay, I look, boom, 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 yes, yes, no, and then I move on. Do not use this method for low frequency behaviors. Things I could use this for would be talking, on task or off task behavior, screaming, student being in their seat or student being out of their seat. Special things to remember, this method requires less effort because the observer does not have to observe the behavior for the entire interval, just a portion of the interval or at a specific time in the interval. Time sampling enables the observer to observe one or more behaviors of one or more students, even if the observer has other commitments during the day, such as teaching. Instead of continuously looking for behavior, it gives the observer more time to record the observations, and it is convenient when behavior cannot be observed continuously. However, time sampling is less accurate than interval recording. And remember, interval recording was already an estimate to begin with, so this is even less accurate. It can often underestimate the occurrence of behavior. For instance, if a behavior occurs at times other than the time sample when the observer is recording, the data will only display low levels of behavior. Even though the behaviors did occur, the data shows that it did not, simply because it did not occur in the small window of time that was being observed. This is an example, looks just like the other, of how you could record that information. All right, this is our rubric. And yes, I know it's too small for you to see. The rubric is available on our iLearn page in the folder labeled rubrics. I will grade your paper straightforward, exactly to the T, based on the rubric. So if you follow the rubric, you're going to be golden. You're going to be perfectly fine. Many of you might be thinking, okay, how long does this project have to be? As with our other ones, I'm not giving you a specified length. I'm saying follow the rubric. So as long as you've included the information that you need. So to begin with, make sure that you have a cover page. Easiest way to get 4 points is to have a cover page. Easiest way to lose an instant 4 points is to not have a cover page. So start off with a cover page. Then you need an introduction that's worth 10 points. So the introduction, and this assignment, by the way, is 200 points. So this one assignment is worth 2 letter writes, potentially. The introduction needs to be, what are we doing? So what are we collecting data on? Why do we collect data? So now what you're talking about, what it is that you're doing, why it is that you're doing it, that type of thing. And then you're going to have a section for each of the 4 different data recordings or data observation types. So the first one is duration. I need to know about the student you're observing for duration. You can be observing the same student for all 4 if that student displays behaviors that are appropriate for all 4 different types. This is where your conversations come into play with the teacher on the front end before you go in to actually observe. So if you sit down with the teacher and they say, oh yes, Susie will give you more than enough data in every different area, then fine, you can observe just simply Susie. However, if they say, well, Susie typically does this, that, and the other, whereas Sally usually has tantrums, Susie's usually out of her seat, Sandy usually does this, and Johnny usually does this. So you may need up to 4 different students. Like I said, that information you've got to collect from the student on the front end. I mean, not from the student, from the teacher on the front end about what type of behaviors are typical in that classroom setting. So as far as 1 student or 4 students, 2 students, 3 students, that depends on the class, that depends on the behaviors that the students are displaying. But for each of the types of recordings, so starting out with duration, I need information about the student. Tell me about the student. What grade are they in? Female, male? Do you know whether or not they have an IEP? Do you know if they do have an IEP, what is the disability area? What is the typical, is this a student that's typically performing well academically? Is this a student that struggles academically? Is this a student who is new to the school, new to the classroom? So tell me whatever you can about that student, that demographic information about the student. And then tell me what is the behavior that you're observing? Define it. Don't just say, well, Susie has an attitude and the teacher wants me to watch her. No, define the behavior. What is it exactly that you're observing? And why do you feel that it's appropriate for duration recording? And then you're going to give me the graph that goes along with your data, the graph that tells the story. You're going to give me data analysis and insight. So you're going to tell me about the data that you collected. You're going to give me the information. What did you observe? What was happening? What was going on? Did you see something that might have triggered the behavior beforehand? Do you have an idea of what function the behavior might be serving for this student? Can you tell me about strategies the teacher used to try to stop the behavior, or what strategies you think might be effective? So you're going to give me your data analysis and insight about that behavior. So for each of the different 4 recording types, I need a description of the student. I need the graph that goes along with the information. And I need your analysis and interpretation of what's going on with the student, what you saw, what triggers you saw, what was happening, what the student was doing, what the adult was doing, what the other students in the room were doing. So no, it's that description. You're going to do the same thing for the event recording, and then the same thing for latency recording, and then the same thing for, you can either do interval recording or time sampling. So all 4 of those different recording types. Then you're going to have a conclusion and reflection. Please make sure that you upload your Excel raw data. That's an easy 12 points for just simply uploading your Excel raw data. So for this one assignment with your one submission, you will have a Word document with the graphs embedded when you're talking about them. And you will also have an Excel file upload. So 2 files, 1 submission. It says writing expectations here, 20 points. Please, 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 please do not copy and paste the writing expectations from our syllabus into your paper. Demonstrate your mastery of the writing expectations by making sure that you've gone back and checked for correct spelling, punctuation, completeness of thought, that your sentences are clear and concise, and that what you're saying is conveying the information it needs to. This does not need to be a 15-page paper. This does not need to have any other resources for like a works cited page. It is a formal paper though, so I don't want slang. We're not doing just simple bullet points. It is written in paragraph format, in formal writing style. Like I said, there's not a specified required length, but where it says data analysis and insight, including a statement of what you believe the function of the behavior is, make sure that you're giving me more than 2 sentences. I've had papers in the past where students have said the student was a girl in the 2nd grade. They gave me a graph. They said she was out of her seat 15 times during the period, and then went on to the next type. And then they didn't understand why they didn't get the score that they might have been looking for on the paper. Where it says data analysis and insight, I'm looking for some evidence of some thought. I'm looking for evidence that I want you to think about it as if this was the behavior you're observing in your classroom, and you had to talk to the parent about it, you had to talk to administrators about the behavior that was going on. What are you going to tell them? What is it that you saw? What was it that you think might be triggering the behavior? What strategies do you think might help the student? In other words, give me your insight. Give me your insight. So give me the analysis of what's going on, and then give me your insight about what you think about it, what you think can be done about it. Why do you think the behavior is going on? Do you think it could be prevented? Or do you think that we just need to look at teaching and replacement behavior? What function is it? Why do you think the child's acting the way that they are? So again, the rubric for this assignment, straightforward, 200 points. Cover page, introduction, and then for each of the 4 recording sections, recordings types of, for each of the different 4 recordings for behavior, duration, event, latency, and interval recording, I need a description, demographic information about the student, as much as you can tell me. Remember, I don't want real names. Don't give me the student's real first and last name for their privacy confidentiality. Either give me just the first name, give me initials, or make up a name. That's fine. But I do not want their true legal names because of their confidentiality. I need a graph that paints the picture, and then I need true analysis and insight on your part. You do that for each of the 4 recording types, and then your conclusion. Don't forget to upload your Excel spreadsheet, and don't forget to demonstrate your mastery of the writing expectations. Again, follow the rubric, kind of like follow the yellow brick road. Follow the rubric, and you'll be perfectly fine. All right. This is just to let you know that most of the information in here came verbatim and or was slightly modified or paraphrased from these sources that are listed here. This PowerPoint is available for you on our iLearn page. I wanted to make sure that you had it. This was just to give you a brief description or a brief overview of the project at hand. Again, if you have any questions, if there's anything that you need me to go back over, review, restate for you, I'll see you in class on Tuesday. Wishing you best wishes. God bless. Take care. See you guys soon. Thanks. Bye.